Good morning, everybody. This is week 2 of our FDN2400 class. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend and great first week of classes. It's Dr. Alicia here. This presentation is based on our readings for the week. I did find a typo in our working online course schedule. In one of the textbooks, our weekly readings for Whistling Vivaldi, each week shows that we're going to read chapter 4. That is not the case. I'll be updating the Whistling Vivaldi chapter readings each week in our As You Learn site. So for week 2, go ahead and read chapter 2, A Mysterious Link Between Identity and Intellectual Performance. I did update the chapter on our As You Learn page for the week 2 assignments. So, please note, I did find that typo, and we will not be reading chapter 4 every week. That would be horrible. Alright, so let's get started on week 2. We're going to be talking about the equity literacy framework. This is the framework that you all are going to use for analyzing the case studies in your ed teams, and I just kind of wanted to frame how this process is going to work for you all each week, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background information. So, our learning objectives today are going to be to define the skills and dispositions of equity literate educators. You all are going to be able to recognize the differences between cultural competency and social justice practices, and we're going to get a little bit into positionality and how knowledge is constructed this week. We'll review some key definition and concepts. And if you all have not noticed yet, there is a glossary, an interactive glossary link in the week 2 section. Please feel free to add any words or concepts that you feel might be important for our discussion or for using in any of the work that we do during the class. It is an open forum. I've posted some definitions and concepts there, but I would love to have all of y'all contribute as you go through the readings and capture some aha moments and put them in the glossary. That would be great. I'd like to kind of look at that at the end of our semester to see some of the themes and trends that we found for ideas that were important, and maybe you all can bring those with you to your next classes. And then finally, the actual approach to analyzing the case studies in our text, the diversity and social justice education case studies. Y'all are going to be looking exactly at how that seven-step case analysis approach works. So I hope this PowerPoint's informative. Again, I have a question thread at the top of our As You Learn site. It's the forum for you all to ask questions, but hopefully this week will be a pretty nice week for you all. So, you can see here the key concepts and vocabulary on the slide. I've highlighted opinion and critical thinking here as a reminder that you want to be on the critical thinking end of the spectrum as it relates to the continuum from opinion to critical thought. We're going to be working through many ideas that have shaped our present opinions about school education, the students and families that we serve, and many of our opinions of these different ideas can be harmful to the productive development of equitable and inclusive environments in our classrooms. So I want you all to think about, before we discuss, before we post anything, before we submit final drafts of anything, are you working from an opinion construct or are you working from a critical thinking construct? This is going to be very important to how I look at your writing and your discussions. Opinions are not going to be assessed favorably in this course. I've provided a lot of resources for you all in terms of journal articles and outside references will be included in our class. So you're going to have plenty of data and information to use as you go through our discussions and our assignments. So I encourage every one of you to use the resources that you've been provided in the course. The text that we have to draw from, they're all based on refereed and research-based environments, and are the most current. I've tried to get the most current within 5 years research-based protocols, information, and procedures for you all. Some of the ideas and concepts are going to be contrary to some or all of your held beliefs about teaching and education. This is natural. Equity and social justice concepts are typically not standard conversation in a lot of the coursework and classes that you all may have been in. They're not typical of the general conversations that you see in schools today. It's a very unique school that has embraced all of these concepts. You all are a work in progress as pre-service teachers, so I implore every one of you to suspend your disbelief for the next few weeks that we're together so you can build your critical thinking skills about these concepts and topics. So let's look at the differences between the concepts that often get confused as the same thing. So opinion is based on our individual superficial understanding of things. It lacks depth of analysis and thought. A lot of what you see in popular media, popular culture, is based on opinion, and we are trained to sound bites. We're trained for quick news stories. We're trained for social media that gives us a quick picture and a headline of a topic, and most likely a lot of us don't actually click through to read a lot of the information that is coming into our heads and minds from social media. So this is what I mean from opinion. I want you all to move beyond that superficial understanding of the things that we're talking about and engage in the depth of the concepts. Okay? Critical thinking, excuse me, it's based on the notion that it helps an individual to build expertise in things, concepts, and ideas. So through your study, your reading, your investigation of the ideas in this course, you're building an informed perspective that you can carry into your professional life as teacher educators, and maybe some of you are going to advance into a school administration. That would be fantastic. The concepts that we discuss here are equally important for school administration as programs and services are developed at that level. It's just really important that we stick to critical thought, critical investigation, and critical discussions. So let me highlight some of the other key vocabulary here. Deficit thinking is a theoretical stance that researchers in education and social capital researchers talk about in terms of folks who believe that minoritized groups are responsible for their circumstances, and that if there was only effort made for these groups, that they would succeed and excel in their endeavors. So deficit thinking basically is an individual in a position placing blame on marginalized persons. In our case, it's teachers placing blame on our marginalized students and families and their cultures for student underachievement. And it excuses, this is the key part, deficit thinking excuses the external systemic societal forces and school practices that a lot of teacher educators are unable or unwilling to explore as causes for gaps in student achievement. So again, we're looking at, in this course, we're looking at systems. We're looking at how systems work, how we're socialized into systemic thought about people, places, and things. Deficit thinking is a highly negative stance for a teacher to take, particularly with social groups who have been marginalized in our society and in our systems, because it fails to recognize the issues and practices that have been built up within the system of education that cause inequity and a lack of inclusive environments for students to learn and access education. So I want you all to think about what kind of deficit thoughts that you've had about students and families. I can give an example. I teach online at another university, elementary education students, and a common pattern of thinking that always comes up in my lesson planning class for elementary educators is that if only my parents of the students in the schools, if only they took education seriously enough to fill in the blank, help their students with their homeworks, come to a parent conference, attend back to school night, participate more in response to calls home from teachers and students. All of these are positions of deficit thinking because it doesn't take into account what is going on with the actor that is being discussed. So I really highlight deficit thinking because we are all victim to that at any given point in the day as educators. We have to be very mindful of when we start having deficit thoughts and changing them immediately. And again, critically thinking about what it is that we are observing and what inequities are presented to us in that situation that we're looking at. Okay, so that's a big one. Oppression is another big one, and basically it is one group enforcing their prejudice and discrimination over marginalized, minoritized group. Okay, again, this is a systemic issue. It is not about individuals. It's not about one person against another. That plays out within the system, but the system itself is what we are thinking about when it comes to oppression within institutions. It occurs at the group and macro or larger level, and again, it is not about me and you oppressing somebody. It is about the systems, policies, and practices that are in place in our education system that work to create inequitable and socially unjust systems of practice and policy. Okay, so again, you may have a common thought that oppression, when we talk about that, is about one person or against another. It is not. It's about a system that enforces oppressive policies, practices, and procedures to groups, not individuals. Okay. Ideology, you all see this every day. The best example I can give is conservative news versus so-called conservative news versus so-called liberal-focused news versus so-called local news. All of those are espousing shared ideas of that particular group, and they are reinforced throughout the institution of media. Okay, so when you look at CNN versus Bloomberg News versus WBTV News in Charlotte, all of these are manifesting a particular ideology to advance a media agenda and to make money. Okay, so ideology are the big shared ideas of a society that are reinforced throughout all the institutions. So in my example, media, mass media is the institution that reinforces the ideology of those particular news outlets. education is another institution that has shared ideas of a society, and it's reinforced from the time that we walk into public education through the time that we finish graduating from college. The easiest example I can give in education is Columbus discovered America. Well, we can look and see that Columbus was not the first person on the shores of North America. We know that there were indigenous populations here, but the ideology of Columbus and what Columbus represented in terms of American education is what we need to start critically thinking about and delving deep into the concept of discovery of America and what that means. Okay, so I'm not going to go too deep into that, but ideology are the rationalizations that are used to justify inequality in societies. And then hegemony is basically power, and in our case with social justice, it is the imposition of dominant group ideology onto everybody else in society. Okay, this is how social control is achieved through the education process and the textbooks that we have for our students, in the way that teachers interpret the information in the textbooks, the development of the actual curriculum from K to 12 across disciplines, and the hidden curriculum that is taught implicitly in all of our schools based in policies, procedures, and practices that are unseen and influence how marginalized groups experience the public school experience. So if you think about hegemony, think about it as dominant group ideology that exerts a particular power to maintain a certain control over that power. And then finally, social group, and we're going to look at the next slide here, is how we're going to talk about various marginalized groups versus various dominant groups. And we all cut across these social group identifications in one way or another. They are not just about race. They are not just about ethnicity. You will see in our next slide the various groups that we're going to talk about in this course. So let me skip to the social groups table. I had these in the wrong order. So some of this vocabulary on this chart I've added to our interactive glossary. The first column, minoritized and target social groups. These are the groups, when we talk about hegemony and social control, dominant ideologies work against, and dominant ideologies work towards the oppression and the socially unjust practices and ideologies in our public schools against these folks in the first column. Okay? This is just so you all can get, so we all can get on the same page with the language in this group. Okay? So again, the first column is the minoritized and disadvantaged groups that we are looking at in this course. The far right column are the dominant and advantaged groups that we look at in this course, and they are the group with the power, so to speak, over the minoritized target social group. So you can see the ideology of these dominant groups are the ones that are pervasive across the education system and in our society. Okay, so how you see that manifested is in the middle column through racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, religious oppression, anti-Semitism, ableism, nationalism, and colonialism. Those are the systemic routes of oppression from dominant ideologies towards non-dominant social groups. All right. Remember, this is a systemic and institutionalized view of these relationships between dominant ideology and how it works towards minoritized groups. Okay? They do not represent individuals like you or I. We're going to be looking at how our positions within this socialized system helps to maintain the balance of power. Again, that's through explicit and implicit activities that we have in schools and classrooms, and how knowledge is constructed around these relationships to maintain unequal education system access based on dominant perspectives, and keeping the dominant ideology the mainstay of our education system. So we're going to look at how we can begin to start dismantling these ideologies and creating equal access for all of our students. So in our case study book on page 12, Gorski and Pathini remind us that there's something deeper and more complex going on, and I add in the education system, that has to do with opportunity, access, social conditions, and the messiness of socioeconomic status and class inequity. Let's just think about that for a minute. Something deeper, more complex going on, and I'll add in the education system, that has to do with opportunity, access, social conditions, and the messiness of socioeconomic status and class inequity. So if we remain on the surface of our opinions based on what cultural competency means, what social justice means, we're never going to get to nor see nor understand what the systemic challenges of the minoritized groups in this first column face every day in education systems, economic systems of this country, and the social systems of this country. Those are just to name a few of the systems that impact how these minoritized groups live in our system today. I do want to point out that Steele and Whistler Vivaldi, he does provide us one window into how these relationships work, specifically with the idea of stereotype threat, how minoritized groups understand the perceptions around who they are and the mental and emotional work that they must do within these systems to overcome systemic ideologies about who and what they are. And it influences their performance, which we are beginning to see. So we're going to look at, what it is that we do. How can teacher educators improve conditions for the diverse student groups that we serve, specifically those coming from these different minoritized groups? We need to have a vocabulary and framework for thinking about systemic inequality and oppression in the education system and in our classroom systems specifically. So I'm going to go back to the slide on cultural competency and equity literacy, because these are going to be important as we look at the framework that Gorski and Pathini provide to us for analyzing our cases. Okay, so cultural competency and equity literacy are complementary partners. They are not the same thing. They are similar in the fact that they describe actions that teacher educators can take to build equitable, inclusive, and socially just learning environments, but they are different in the actions that we would see in practice. Okay? Cultural competency are the actions that support inclusivity in the school and the classroom. It's a way to build our knowledge of the different social groups and how to build inclusive environments through developing our understanding about individuals different from us and using that knowledge to create inclusive environments. So if we look at the bullets here, Cultural competency means in action that we as teacher educators develop a knowledge of cultural diversity generally. So who is it that is in our class? Where do they come from? What do they believe? What do they value? It's a good thing. Culturally competent teacher educators design culturally relevant curricula. So when you see teachers including, let's say in an English class, including books that come from a range of authors that are representative of the students in their class, in a music orchestra course, you see the orchestra teacher bringing in compositions across various cultures in our global society, not just traditional European pieces of music. We see that culturally competent teacher educators know how to demonstrate cultural caring and how to build a learning community around diversity and different cultures. They know how to develop cross-cultural communication skills, and they ensure cultural congruity in the classroom. These are all important concepts that teacher educators need to understand and practice in their classrooms. But cultural competency does not work towards dismantling systems of equity. Okay? So, how many of you have participated in or planned an International Day? Or how many of you have attended a rally related to issues on equality and access for different groups? These are helping to build cultural competency. They're actions that can be taken to learn about a thing, an issue, idea, about folks that are different from us. Okay? It's different from equity literacy in that equity literacy is a state of understanding systemic inequity and driving action to build socially just learning environments. So enabling students, for example, in Steele's book, to overcome stereotype threat and to help close achievement gaps. Okay? So, again, equity literacy is actions to take steps that teacher educators take to dismantle systemic oppression that we see in education. That is the classroom, the schoolhouse, and the district as a whole. It's about understanding systems of inequity and how they impact different minoritized groups, that first column in the chart that I just showed you, which limit their opportunity while advancing opportunities of dominant groups. I know that's a lot to grab onto, but that's what equity literacy practice does. So, equity literate educators have the ability to recognize bias and inequities and address them. They respond to these biases and inequities immediately. Okay? They make change to ensure that those biases and inequities impacting students and their families stop. Equity literate educators have the ability to redress biases and inequity in systems for the long term. So what that look like, it may be that a teacher educator will put together a work group to look at school discipline policies and how those policies systemically oppress minoritized student groups. Okay? And by redressing the biases in that policy, that's a long-term focus for making discipline policies within the school a little bit more equitable, ultimately giving everybody equitable access to discipline structures that are fair and are administered across the board fairly. Okay, and then finally, equitable teacher educators and literate teacher educators in equity concepts are able to create and sustain bias-free and equitable learning environments. And it starts in your classroom, and then it moves to the school. And like I said earlier, if you're moving into administration, being armed with these skills can help immediately change the systems of oppression in the school building. So, in your Ed Team case study analysis, in the Gorski and Pathini book, this is all about actual practice in using your equity literacy skill development. Okay, these case studies are going to help you walk through these 4 bullets in the equity literacy column. You're also going to use these in our education philosophy papers that you all are going to be writing in terms of looking at learning, looking at classroom organization, looking at your teaching style, looking at how you develop a classroom climate, looking at how you motivate your students, and what kind of disciplinary approaches that you are going to take to, looking at that 4th bullet under the equity and literacy column, to create and sustain bias-free and equitable learning environments. This is what your ed philosophy is going to be grounded in, and that is the theme of your education philosophy statements that you're going to be creating. Demonstrating through your philosophical perspective how you're going to create and sustain bias-free and equitable learning environments in your teaching and learning, your classroom organization, how you motivate students, your teaching style, the classroom climates that you develop through your discipline and socialization in your classroom. Okay, we're going to talk about more detail, I think, in week 3 or week 4 on this ed philosophy paper, but for now you all are going to be focused in this equity literacy column. Does that make sense? I hope so. Alright, so I'm going to go into some concepts on positionality and knowledge construction. Our discussion questions this week are going to be centered around this PowerPoint and the information in this PowerPoint. I have taken from all 3 of our textbooks. I've provided some articles in the week 2 article folder that you all can use. But we're going to spend time discussing about positionality and knowledge construction in the classroom and in the school and in society, and how our individual positionalities influence the way we build knowledge for ourselves and for our students. Okay? So, I don't know if this is new vocabulary for some of y'all, but let me just give you some definitions here. Positionality, according to Sensoy and D'Angelo in our text, is everyone really equal? It's in chapter 2 where they define positionality as the recognition that where an individual stands in relation to others in a society shapes what the individual sees and understands about the world. This positionality that we each carry brings with it a few questions that we need to think about. Now we're going to go deep diving a little bit into some critical thinking here and moving beyond the opinion and anecdotes of our life. So, what is our personal positionality, and how do we become to know what we know as people? All right. So, thinking in from the time that we can remember back to when we started learning as kids up until what we have accumulated in terms of knowledge, how did our positionality in the world, where we came from, who our parents were, who did we play with on the playground, who do we go to school with? All of these are keys to how we position ourselves in the world. How did we become to know what we know today? Okay? All of that is influenced on the position that we have been raised in. As education professionals, which all of us are, my assumption is that All of you all are going to graduate from Appalachian State University and move into your own classrooms, secure a teaching contract. So I am working on the assumption that you all are teachers already. You are pre-service teachers, but you're teachers nonetheless. So, as education professionals, when we are in our classroom, what are the values that we're reflecting to our students? Okay? Again, this is based on our positionality, where we come from, how we got here, what has been taught to us via our families, what we've been exposed to in our own personal world. All of those values become a part of our classroom practice, and we need to interrogate and investigate and understand where we are coming from so we can become better equity literate educators. Okay, and then finally, as education professionals, what and whose interest are we serving? So, we're raised in very specific environments. Each one of us has a very unique experience growing up from children to adults that we are now. And we have been taught, very specific values, beliefs, understandings about the world around us. Whose interests do they serve? And I want y'all to go back to, when we're thinking about interests, I want y'all to go back to this dominant ideology column, okay? And if we think about the interest of our society and where we place value, it's in these areas that we live in, okay, in America. Our ideology is based on these ideologies in one way or another, okay? And how we are raised is wrapped within the ideology that these represent. And those that are influenced through these oppression systems are the persons listed in these columns. So, take for instance, this row. We can see that we have a ways to go to ensuring equal access for people with disabilities across our systems in terms of accessing school, accessing classwork, accessing the opportunity to learn in equal environments based on our specific disabilities. When we are in public spaces in the world, it is framed around able-bodiedness. So while we do have handicap parking and we do have ramps on certain areas, if we put ourselves into the shoes of folks with disabilities, I'm sure that we would have a very different perspective on accessing systems, places, and things. Okay, so that's just one example of how the interest that we're serving. Okay, and what values that we reflect as individuals. So Steele talks about in chapter 2 taking on the role of the actor versus the role of the outsider, which is what we are trained to do as educators. We're trained to look at the actors and we're trained to diagnose what they need to be successful. But we can't do that without knowing where that actor is coming from and what they're experiencing. All right, so our positionality and knowledge construction is, like I said, developed from all of our experiences from the time that we start learning. Banks has outlined a typology that Sensoy and D'Angelo have showed us in our text, Is Everyone Really Equal? It's on page 30. The Banks' typology talks about how positionality in knowledge is constructed, and that our knowledge as individuals from the time that we begin learning is constructed from 5 sources. Okay, these 5 sources include our personal and cultural knowledge, and this is what we are socialized in about the world and everything in it from growing up in our families, who we hang around, how we went to school. Okay, that's how our personal and cultural knowledge is developed. Our popular knowledge, things about the world, we are socialized about the world and everything in it from popular culture. That is mass media, television, movies, music, social media, the internet, Google, Wikipedia. These are all popular sources of knowledge that uphold dominant ideologies. Okay, so we are socialized from the time that we are born, and from the time that we turn on the TV and start watching television, to progressing to using the internet and looking at cable. We are socialized into dominant ideological perspectives. The next one is our mainstream knowledge, which occurs as we get older in our schooling, and that is manifested through what we learn in our college classrooms. These are academic concepts about how the world works from a behavioral and social science perspective. You get a lot of this in post-secondary education, where you are researching and investigating phenomenon from the natural sciences and the social sciences to critically think about the world around you, and how the world works. So the simplest construction I can give of that is that we know from natural science that the earth is round, it revolves around the sun, and all the planets in our solar system are aligned in a way that they revolve around the sun as well. Okay, that's mainstream knowledge. And then the fourth is school knowledge, and how we're socialized when we walk into our first kindergarten classroom. Okay, this socialization occurs through K to 12, and it's called school knowledge. And this is the socialization about topics, history, social studies, science, math, the arts in our formal schooling, from our teachers, the curriculum, the overt curriculum and the hidden curriculum, and in the way that our teachers interpret these ideas, concepts, and things for us in the classroom. So this is where you all are going to start beginning to think about your interpretations, your interrogation of the knowledge and concepts that you all are going to be teaching in your various subject areas, and how you will interpret those for your students. Are you going to interpret them in a way that you're going to uphold dominant ideologies and maintain a system of inequity and non-inclusivity in the school? Or are you going to start implementing the skills and dispositions of equity literate educators? That's what this school knowledge is. And we have a very special opportunity here to begin to use our knowledge and understanding to bring access, equitable access to knowledge and information to the students that we are serving and going to serve in the future. Okay? And then Banks's fifth knowledge is socialization that comes from how we learn to unlearn a lot about how we've been socialized in dominant ideologies in our lives, and how we have come to believe and see things the way that we see them today. And this is called transformative academic knowledge. So courses like this that provide students an opportunity to think critically about all of the stuff that we've learned in the 4 sources that I've just reviewed, and begin to understand that knowledge construction comes from how folks' lived experiences influence their values, beliefs, and actions. So while we all come from a wide range of backgrounds and communities, we are all living within the same system of socialization. And depending on the vantage point of where we come from, is how our dominant ideologies influence our present thinking today. Okay, so transformative academic knowledge is how we transform our thinking from dominant ideologies about social group positions to see the world for who it is and what it is, to see the folks in the world from minoritized groups and dominant groups for who they are, how we've come to be who we are in all of these groups, and how we get to know them better and more critically through the lens of their lived experiences. Okay? So we're going to be interrogating dominant ideologies and how we come out of those and understand how folks in the system navigate their minoritized lives within the dominant ideological perspective of the education system. Okay? If you all turn to page 32 in our Is Everyone Really Equal book, there's a story about a research project with elementary students, and it's a class socioeconomic research study that was done with elementary students about how knowledge is constructed, and they were basically asked that question: how is knowledge constructed? And they questioned students from low socioeconomic, middle socioeconomic, and affluent socioeconomic backgrounds. And each one of those groups had very different responses to the three questions. I implore and recommend that you all read that. It starts on page 32. I think you'll find it very interesting. So, I want to encourage all of y'all to reflect on your positionality, particularly in the 5 areas of knowledge construction that we just talked about, and how it's influenced your worldview of our society, the systems in our society, and the patterns within the system we're a part of that support dominant ideologies and come up all the time when we are interacting with different social groups. Okay? At the bottom of page 17 in our text, Is Everyone Really Equal?, you will see some exercises about how to think about your positionality as we move through the course. Just want to highlight a quote from that. Sensoy and D'Angelo say, identify your social positionality and stay attentive to how it informs your response to the course content, particularly how your class, race, gender, etc., your ability status. What limitations of awareness might you have as a result of that positionality? What are the things you can and can't see based on the social positions that you hold or that you do not hold? Okay? This is going to be crucial as you work through your thinking about your education practice, and specifically on the case study analysis that you all are going to be working on this semester in your ed team. Okay? So let's look at the equity literacy framework. I'm not going to read through these 4 because I touched on these a little bit in our discussion on cultural competency versus equity literacy, but I do want to highlight for you that these are the skills, and we're going to talk about some dispositions here in a minute, that are necessary for all pre-service teachers, novice teachers, and master teachers to understand, to become proficient in, and master pedagogies that dismantle socially unjust practices within our education system. And they help to create more inclusive and equitable learning environments for all students, and just opening up education environments, practices, and policies for the children that we serve. Okay, these literacies, if you only take one thing from this course, these 4 things are what I want you all to grab onto and develop as you go through the College of Education here at Appalachian State. Okay, so we're going to look at each one of these literacies in terms of the actual skills and dispositions that are observable in a classroom of an equity literate educator. Okay, so for number 1, in being able to recognize biases and inequities, anybody coming into a school that is framed around social justice and creating inclusive environments are going to be able to see the educators within that school noticing subtle bias in class materials, interactions, and school policies. So if you walk into a classroom and are doing a classroom observation, you're going to see actual action in the curriculum, in the delivery of the curriculum, that reflects the teacher who has identified bias in the class materials, how the interactions in the classroom are affected by bias, and have developed classroom policies that address bias in the classroom. These teachers, also have a thorough and full rejection of deficit thinking. They do not blame students and or their cultures for performance gaps, and that they recognize the gaps come from systemic issues of inequity across different student groups. And again, this is why Steele's book, Whistling Vivaldi, is so important, because it helps us to understand some pretty basic notions about deficit thinking. So literacy ability number 2, responding to biases and inequities immediately. You will observe in that same school the educators developing their facilitation skills and gaining the knowledge that they need to intervene when bias and inequities show up in the school. So because we're socialized into dominant ideologies, this is an ongoing work in progress. But if you understand where the inequities are coming from and you delve deep into your critical thinking activities, equity literate educators demonstrate that they know how to intervene in situations where these unfortunate circumstances occur for students and for peers in the school. And they encourage conversations about it. So in the same school, you will see work groups that are focused on updating discipline policies that are inequity and filled with bias against certain groups of students. You will see educators and parents working together on building school climates that are open and provide access to all students. Academic programming, part of your research project. You will see those programs in schools and policies in schools that respond and intervene to cut out bias and equity in the school so students can learn in a safe and equitable environment. Ability number 3, this is the long-term redress of bias and inequity. You will see in the same school that inequitable school practices, for instance, in the first bullet, like tracking students into a line of study. You will see how school administrations, leadership teams, and teachers work to dismantle lanes of learning for different students of different groups. they're constantly advocating for policies that dismantle. They also, you won't see cultural competency being diluted and mixed as and demonstrated as being equitably just. There's, like I said earlier, we talked about, there's a clear difference to celebrating diversity versus dismantling inequitable situations for students in the school. So these educators never confuse celebrating diversity with dismantling inequitable situations. And then finally, creating and sustaining bias-free and equitable learning environments. Expressing high expectations for all students. Again, Steele in Whistling Vivaldi is going to give us some clear direction and actions to take that are easily implemented by all of us to work through ways to overcome our deficit thinking and move toward a more high expectation for all students, and to help us cultivate classroom environments where your students are going to feel free to express themselves openly and honestly. So this is an action-oriented and solution-focused framework. You can see the table on page 13 in our case studies on diversity and social justice in education. They are broken down on page 13 and explained here. I have made a discussion question 3 for this week around this particular framework specifically. The subject that that discussion is based on is on class and school discipline policies. Okay, so hopefully we'll have some good discussions around this. So let's look at how we're going to analyze your ed team cases this semester. You will have a case due in week 2, your first one. You'll see that listed in the team assignments. You are going to use the 7-step approach for equity literacy case analysis. There is a nice chart on page 14, but Gorski and Pathini, they go through what this looks like in each step. I want to remind all of you that the goal of your Ed Team case study analysis work is for each of you to dismantle and demonstrate your collective and individual understanding of the equity literacy skills framework for educators in order to dismantle your dominant ideological perspective. Okay? We are all immersed in that every day, and we have to consistently think about why we think a thing, why we know a thing, and where it comes from. So these case studies are a way for you to think about all of those things. I hope that you all take the time for this opportunity to have critical discussions among yourselves in your ed teams about teaching and professional behaviors that do begin to dismantle systems of oppression and bias in your schools that you're going to serve. It's practice today for implementation tomorrow. Okay. You can use these principles also in all of your courses from this semester until you graduate through AP and into your career as teachers. So the way that I'm going to measure your level of mastery, your team level of mastery, is going to be in the form of your write-ups that are framed within the 7-step approach. And I will see evidence of each of these 7 steps here. This is from page 14 in our case studies on diversity and social justice education book. I will see evidence of these 7 steps in the team write-ups. Okay, I do have a grading guide for you all to look at and understand the specific criteria, but know that I'm going to expect to see language that reflects each of these steps. So in step 1, I want to see reflected in your write-ups that you have read the case literally and that you've read between the lines to identify the problem or problems posed by the case. Everything is not what you see visibly. There's going to be some invisible problems and challenges in the case study that are implied, not directly given to you. So I'm going to see that you all have identified some of those implicit challenges. I'm also going to see that you all have read the case from the point of view of all of the main characters, not just the subject of the case. And I want to see that you have thought about the positionality of these main characters and why they're all responding the way that they do. You all will identify a challenge and an opportunity as a result of the main characters' positionalities, what they face, and a challenge and opportunity of the school and institution in the case study. So that school piece, that institutional piece, may be one of the implicit understandings that you're going to have to draw from the case itself, one of those things that you're going to read in between the lines. Step 4, you're going to show me that you all understand the difference between equitable, meaning fair, and the difference between that and equal, meaning the same outcomes. They are totally different. Equitable outcomes are not the same as equal outcomes. And you need to be able to demonstrate that you know the difference when you start coming up with potential solutions to these case studies in your write-up. Okay? Step 5 and 6 are looking at immediate and long-term solutions to the problems. You all need to break those down. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion on what could be done right then, what can the school do long-term. Break all of those down in your discussion. Brainstorm those. Have critical talks about that. But make sure you bring it back in and edit your short-term, immediate, and your long-term outcomes to a team consensus. I would say 1 or 2 short and long-term outcomes. Okay? And then finally, you're going to develop your action plan and answer all of the questions at the end of the case. You will see once the case is over that there's a page that they're going to reference you to for consideration, and then you're going to get a series of questions. That is where your write-up is going to come from, those questions and these considerations in steps 1 through 6. So the grading guide, again, is below. When you click on the Ed Team assignment directions, you'll see the grading guide. Just be sure that you understand what my expectations are. So that's it for week 2. We will be in discussion all week. Please check out all 3 discussion questions. I think that you all are going to find them interesting. And I really enjoyed Whistling Vivaldi Chapter 2. I look forward to seeing your your observations about what Steele talked about in Chapter 2. He was kind of like mysterious in that chapter. I loved it. To give you all some bits to chew on. And is everyone really equal text? You all are going to get a fantastic view on delineating between opinion, anecdote, and informed thought. So I hope that you all take into consideration the differences between those and understand that we are on the far end of critical thinking here in this course. And also, they do a very good job of talking about positionality and understanding what that means and how we build knowledge based on where we come from and how we've learned growing up. So, I hope you all have a great week, and I kind of like this always believe that something wonderful is about to happen. because it's a good outlook on life and what we do every day in our classrooms. So, you all have a great week, and if you need me, email, call me, come see me. Again, I have blocked out the mornings from 8 to 9 specifically for you all. I'm in 121 in the James Center. So 8 to 9 a.m. and 4 to 5 p.m. are blocked out totally for you all to come see me. If you need office hours, those are your office hours. For me, 8 to 9 Monday through Friday in the morning and 4 to 5 Monday through Friday in the evening. Feel free to come by at any time during that hour. Again, email is another way. I've enjoyed getting emails from you all. Keep doing that. And I look forward to seeing y'all later. Take care.